Hello and welcome to Byline Live with me, Adam Bienkov, and our chief reporter, Josiah Mortimer. Hello, Josiah. How are you doing?
I'm good.
Had a good day?
It's been interesting, hasn't it? Yeah, we've been...
Had a second week of Kemi Badenoch at Prime Minister's Questions. I believe you've been in the chamber for both of those, both last week and this week. How's she doing?
She's had quite a faltering start. No one had particularly high expectations of her, I don't think. But she's chosen some quite weird things to lead on. I mean, today at Prime Minister's Questions, she was very much focused on this supposed gap in council funding for the next year, which, considering the fact that the Tories, I think they halved council budgets over the last 14 years, was a pretty bold one to go off. And of course, those cuts massively supported by Kemi Badenoch and others on the current front bench of the Tory party. So yeah, a bit of a strange one to lead on, I think. It was just interesting combing through some YouGov polling that's come out on Kemi Badenoch today. Most voters, or certainly the plurality of voters, don't have a view on her yet. And I think it's fair to say, just looking at the stats, so 39% of voters don't know. Basically, they don't have an opinion on her, which is actually similar to Ed Davies' figure, so the leader of the third party. So she's coming in from quite, I suppose, anonymous point, which suggests that she's got space to grow and improve.
How does that compare to previous Conservative leaders?
I think it's the highest rate of don't knows for people who don't have an opinion on her yet. But it's also, she's got one of the highest unfavourability ratings. So 41% of voters, of those who do have a view, don't like her, basically. And again, that is higher than for many other Tory leaders. So she's both quite unknown, but also those who know her
don't think much
of her. Yeah.
Why do you think that is? Why hasn't she kind of cut through? Because it's been an incredibly long leadership election campaign for the Conservative Party. And the logic behind that decision to have such a long campaign was that it would help them to introduce the likely candidates to the country and also to have a big policy debate about the future of the country. Not only does she not seem to have been introduced to the country, those who have seen her don't seem to have a good impression of her. She also doesn't seem to have any policies either. It's been interesting actually at Prime Minister's Questions today. A lot of the exchanges, Keir Starmer was able to say, well, what would you do differently? And she hasn't really set out what she would do differently yet, has she?
No, and I think the Tories are making a deliberate decision, basically not to come up with any alternative proposals to what Labour are doing. And the Conservative headquarters spokesperson, you were in there with me as well after Prime Minister's Questions today, admitted as such. He basically said, no, we're not going to come up with alternatives to what the government are doing until much closer to the election. So at this point, basically the Conservatives are being opposition for opposition's sake and basically saying no to most of the things that are being put in front of them by the government.
What's the logic behind that? Why is she taking that position?
It's hard to say. I mean, to a certain extent, I think they're finding their feet, and Kemi Badenoch's maybe deciding what she thinks is going to win over more of the public. And I think at this stage, they really don't know. Maybe they're waiting for Labour to decline further in the eyes of voters before they put forward their own proposals. There's that maxim, isn't there, which is don't interrupt your enemy while they're tripping up. But I think Keir Starmer came out as the stronger one today, and he is in the sense that he can say to any opposition that's coming from Kemi Badenoch, well, look at what we've been left, essentially, and it's public services that are completely falling apart. And I think voters at this stage, although they might not fully like everything that the Labour Party are doing, they do see that public services are completely knackered.
I guess from Badenoch's perspective, she might think, well, there's no point in coming out with any policies now because none of this is going to be relevant in 4 or 5 years' time at the next general election. What's the point in tying myself down to policies that aren't going to be relevant? I think the risk for her and for the Conservatives is that she ends up looking more like a commentator than a politician. And she comes across like that a bit today at Prime Minister's Questions. There was that exchange today when she said, well, of course I agree with all those things that you're trying to do. And Keir Starmer would come back and say, well, you're not saying how you're going to pay for any of that. I wonder whether, I mean, she's a very kind of online politician. And she's also a former employee at The Spectator as well. Whether that kind of almost being more of a commentator than politician is a risk for the Conservative Party at this stage.
Yeah, I think so. And I think it actually carries, obviously not everyone watches PMQs, but I think the vibe that she gives out in these spats in Parliament is that she's like an interviewer of the Prime Minister and not a particularly forensic one. There was a really farcical moment last week in her first PMQs when she had one of these attempts at witty comebacks that all party leaders have for their sparring sessions at PMQs, where she said the Prime Minister's just relying on scripted answers. The public expect better of that. And then what was the next thing she does? She leans down and she reads out verbatim her next attack line on the Prime Minister. So I think that stuff comes across as being a bit unprofessional, a bit amateurish. As you say, that might not matter in 4 or 5 years, but I think it does add to this sense that is she just an interim leader while the Conservatives decide what they're going to do and what policy direction they're going to take after
she's had a few wobbles,
ranting.
hasn't she? She fluffed her lines a couple of times today, which, considering she seems to be reading them out from a bit of paper, is pretty... Like, why even have the bit of paper if you're going to fluff your lines?
Yeah.
When you're opposition leaders, particularly at this point where the Conservative Party have just suffered such a drubbing at the general election in July, it's very hard to get people's attention, but the one time of the week where you do get that attention is Prime Minister's Questions. How do you make an impact? I think there's a few ways. You can make it by digging out some new fact, some old quote, or some area where the Prime Minister isn't prepared and is going to struggle to respond. She hasn't done that yet. The other way is to find a topic where the Prime Minister disagrees with his party over something. So a good example of that today would have been to highlight Gordon Brown's comments about child poverty and the 2-child benefit cap, which is an area where a lot of the Labour MPs are unhappy. Now, I can understand why she possibly wouldn't go down that route, because he could then just say, well, the reason we're in this mess is because of you, etc. But that's one line of attack you can go on, trying to drive a wedge between the Prime Minister and his party. The third way is to just be funny. And we've seen previous Conservative leaders, like the famous one is William Hague, who's particularly good at that. But even some other third parties, like Vince Cable was particularly good. I mean, you're luckily too young to remember this. But when Gordon Brown was Prime Minister, he came out with a line that Gordon Brown had turned from Stalin to Mr. Bean. And at the time, that was a really funny line that came to define, actually, Gordon Brown's leadership at that point. And she hasn't really had any jokes in either of these sessions that I've noticed. And she hasn't tried to define Keir Starmer other than saying he's got scripted lines, which of course he's got scripted lines. They both got scripted lines. We all know that. So I wonder, what are your thoughts there? Why isn't she making any impact in these sessions?
I think she's partly struggling because there's been this perception of her and this debate around her, which is that she's been characterised as an extremely brash and harsh politician, not particularly likeable. Colleagues don't really get on with her. So I think she's been trying a little bit to be a bit more jokey. But as you say, nothing is really carried, nothing is stuck so far. Obviously still very early days. But you touched on before about what the public think of all this. And I think it's an interesting one because there wasn't really much of a proper public debate about the two Tory leadership contenders, Robert Jenrick and Kemi Badenoch. While that was going on, it was effectively a debate for 130,000 odd Tory members.
The only debate was on GB News, wasn't it, I think? Yeah.
Exactly. And how many people watched that?
And it wasn't even a debate, was it? I think they took turns to answer questions. Wasn't it?
Yeah. Okay, it mattered more when this was basically electing a prime minister.
Yeah.
Now it's His Majesty's loyal leader of the opposition. But I think it still matters. These people are trying to be the next Prime Minister. And what actually cut through to the public during that campaign, just looking back, even as someone who follows, we both followed this stuff very closely, I can't really remember either of them answering questions on their stance on the National Health Service or the future of schools.
Or even the economy, really.
Even the economy. Yeah. It was all about, are you going to leave the European Court of Human Rights? Yeah. And that was the bit that really started, that came up in all of it. And beyond that, there wasn't very much. So it's no surprise, really, that the public don't know who she is.
Well, one issue that she did raise last week was Donald Trump, of course. I think it was the day after the result last week. And she focused on trying to get Keir Starmer to apologise for David Lammy's previous comments about, and there's a certain amount of hypocrisy going on here. There were lots of Conservative politicians who have said discourteous things about Donald Trump, including Kemi Badenoch. I dug up some old comments that she'd made where she said she wasn't a fan of his, and an old tweet that she'd highlighted in an article calling him a useful idiot to Vladimir Putin. So this is a bit of a curious strategy from the Conservatives, isn't it? And we heard it a bit again today after the session. I mean, just to explain, after the Prime Minister's questions, the Prime Minister's spokesman and the leader of the opposition's spokesman takes questions from journalists just behind the chamber. And this came up again where Kemi Badenoch's spokesman was attacking Keir Starmer for, I think he called it student politics of previous criticisms of Trump and Elon Musk as well. But this is a bit of a curious strategy. Why do you think the Conservative Party are pinning themselves so closely to Trump? And what do you think that the impact of that will be?
I think they see it as an open goal. I'm not really sure it is as much of an open goal as they think it is, partly because, many of the Conservatives just really don't like Donald Trump. Many Conservative voters just think he's loathsome. It's a criminal, someone who's been found liable for sexual offences. Why would he have major positive support, even among the right in the UK? He doesn't. Yeah. So I think it is a strange one. Maybe they see themselves as being notionally, ideologically closer to him than the Labour Party. But I think it's a little bit weak. And when you consider that the Tories want to go really hard on, probably will attack Labour for being soft on crime, if they're seen as cozying up so much to someone who is literally a criminal, albeit one who is the new president of the United States, then I think it's quite a strange look.
I mean, I guess the appeal for the Conservatives is they look at what has just happened in the United States and they see a government that's just been kicked out, and they have a president-elect now in Donald Trump who has a reputation for saying what he thinks, being controversial. And I think some people around Kemi Badenoch think, well, maybe she can imitate that. Do you see those similarities, or do you think that's over-egged?
I think it's a little bit over-egged, personally, partly because some of the controversial comments that Kemi Badenoch have made, when you look at them, they are things that are actually just incredibly unpopular. Yeah. And I don't think she's able to carry that in a particularly influential way. I mean, take her comments on maternity pay, suggesting that maternity pay was excessive. That was something that was non-ECHR related that came up during the election. Voters just think, on both sides of the spectrum, just think that's out of touch. And again, on the minimum wage, suggesting it was burdensome on businesses.
Yeah, I mean, just going through some of the lists, I've got a list here of some of the things that she's said since she's become leader. As you say, maternity pay, she's described as excessive. Minimum wage is a burden. Despite saying she's got no policies, or just any policies, she has come out against VAT on private school fees, and she's chosen that as the one policy that she's got. Describing Partygate as overblown, suggesting that free childcare will be cut as well, one of her allies suggesting that, and refusing to distance herself from Liz Truss. This isn't populism, is it? This is unpopulism.
Yeah, unpopulism. Yeah, I like that. And unpopular attempts at populism. I think they are just going to have to come up with some responses to the Labour Party. They have got this reactive approach at the moment. I mean, you saw it actually last night. It hasn't received very much attention at all, but there was Labour attempting to get rid of hereditary peers in the House of Lords. Okay, it's not the world's biggest reform, but what do the Tories do? They oppose the bill. But the reasoning is quite odd, and they came up with all sorts of amendments yesterday in the House of Commons, which were to basically completely reform the Lords, something that they would never support in government, purely because they thought it would embarrass the Labour Party. So they opposed scrapping hereditary peers, but they also tried to chuck in a load of amendments, which would basically derail the bill, calling for Labour to massively overhaul the House of Lords and move to an elected chamber. Now, I don't really know who they're trying to appeal with this stuff.
It all feels a bit scattergun, doesn't it?
Yeah.
There doesn't seem to be much of a strategy. One of the things I've picked up talking to people in Parliament today is that they haven't got much money. And they've got a real shortage of actual advisors, the PADs, political advisors. They haven't got a full slate of those. They've got very little money to pay them. I think they're sort of paying them average wage for London. And a lot of people who were big hitters in terms of being advisors of the Conservative Party have left to the corporate sector. I'd be interested to see how that changes over the coming months. I wonder whether, as we get closer to the election, we might see some people from the IEA and some of those sort of Tufton Street organisations coming back to the Conservative Party. But right now, they're really struggling, I think, in terms of strategy. I mean, presumably Kemi Badenoch's got the full team around her, but they do seem to be making some strange choices so far.
Yeah, and even in this briefing with Kemi Badenoch's spokesman after Prime Minister's questions that we were in today, it was really hard to see what the point was, because we as journalists were asking questions about their response to Labour policies and their response to various issues, including Donald Trump and his supporters' comments on Ukraine, scrapping aid for Ukraine. And the answer we basically got every time was, I haven't spoken to Kemi Badenoch about that. Well, okay, what are you doing here? What are the Conservatives actually offering to the public right now? And it doesn't even feel like they know the answer to that.
So just explain to our listeners a little bit about those briefings. Sometimes we talk about being in the lobby. We're both members of the lobby. But I think most people don't really understand what that is. Just explain briefly, what is a lobby and what are these briefings that happen?
Yeah, you've been in the lobby much longer than I have. I'm a sort of newbie and a part-timer, I suppose. But it's basically a way for journalists to be in Parliament as much as they want to, work from within Parliament. And as part of that, you have these daily press briefings with the Prime Minister's spokesman.
And these are private briefings, aren't they, as we're saying?
Yeah, they are. And you can report what's said, but you have to wait until afterwards. There's no live tweeting of these things, and they're certainly not televised.
And we can't say who the people are.
No, exactly. It's all these anonymous Prime Minister spokesmen. There's all these conventions that are related to it. Someone got told off the other day for tweeting something that was said amid a briefing rather than waiting till afterwards. So all these sorts of arcane rules and things, sort of a closed shop really for political hacks. And I think there is a part of it which has its advantages in that there is a time every single day when journalists can, in theory, probe the Prime Minister's spokesman, ask them any question they want and get answers straight away. But of course, the risk of that when you have a press that's as skewed and broken as ours is that occasionally some of these things are just dominated by one issue, which feels miles away from the concerns of voters.
So what were the questions today then? Moving on to Starmer,
Yeah.
what questions were his spokespeople facing today?
We saw endless questions, and this has been running on for months now, about Sue Gray, his former chief of staff, who was said to be moving to a role as envoy of the nations and regions. In the past few days, it's emerged that she's not going to be taking up that role. And whether she's been told not to take it up because of various internecine warfares and game playing and basically the tabloids hate her, or whether she's been told not to take it up. Whether she
doesn't want to do it.
Doesn't want to do it, exactly. It's not entirely clear, to be honest. In the grand scheme of things, does it really matter? But it's seen as one of these ways of personalising some of the problems that are perceived as being in number 10 at the moment. Personally, I do just zone out when these questions are. Maybe I should care about it more.
What were you asking about today? Because you asked a couple of questions, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. I asked about voter ID, actually. So today, the Labour government had put forward a motion to expand the list of acceptable photo IDs that could be used in elections. And it came as an electoral commission report came out today, basically saying they need to massively expand it because lots of young people are excluded, people on lower incomes are seen as being excluded, and there's no form of digital ID that voters are actually allowed to use, which you think in 2024 is just bonkers. You know, you have digital ID for the NHS and lots of government services, but you can't show it when you're voting. So I asked about that. I said, is the government planning on extending it further? Because the motion that was in front of MPs today was just expanding it to cover veterans. There's this new veterans card. So it's a significant move in the sense that there are 2 million veterans in the UK who will be able to use this card.
This was something that the last government had committed to, wasn't it?
It was, yeah, exactly. And, you know, considering that there's really big cause, basically most Labour MPs think voter ID is a sledgehammer to crack a nut. It's unnecessary. It was a way for the Tories to, in their eyes, disenfranchise lots of voters who wouldn't vote for them. And Labour wouldn't go any further really than saying they'd look at reforms and the only concrete thing they committed to was, as I say, getting veterans, letting them use this veterans
So why are they
ID.
being so timid about this? What's going on?
Maybe it's a sign of the wider timidity that Labour are feeling, particularly, I think, on issues of democratic reform, because I think Labour really struggle to get political reform through in as easy a way that Conservatives get away with it. I mean, you just look at some of the changes that the last government passed, introducing voter ID for the first time ever. On what basis? Well, there were maybe 10 allegations.
The perception of
perception of fraud, exactly. They overhauled the Electoral Commission, the independent watchdog. The government now sets the strategy for that supposedly independent organisation. They imposed first past the post. They changed the voting system for mayors and PCCs. No one had seen that coming. No one wanted that. No one was calling for that. And it all just passed without really any debate. And I think you look at some of the coverage of Labour's plans to introduce votes for 16 and 17-year-olds, which they have quite a clear manifesto commitment to be able to do. Much of that, the right-wing press is going to kick off big time as soon as that's put forward. And it was missing from the King's speech. So you wonder, there are some questions about whether and when Labour are going to come forward with those changes.
We haven't heard anything about that at all, have we?
No.
Vote 16. On voter ID, it didn't seem to me, of all of those reforms that you mentioned, that expanding the list of IDs doesn't seem particularly controversial to me. I can't see where the big opposition to that would come from. Allowing students to use their student ID cards. Why would that be controversial? Why are they not just coming ahead with that?
To be honest, it is strange. I mean, part of me thinks maybe it was a timing thing. The government said, we're going to wait on the Electoral Commission, see what they recommend. But the Electoral Commission said back in September, you should expand this list so students can use their student ID, photo, rail passes and things like that. And for some reason, it's not in this latest package. Is that a sign that they're just not going to bother with any further reform of the system? From some of Byline's coverage, we know that tens of thousands of voters were turned away and didn't get a vote in this year's various elections, local and general election, as a result of ID. So the impact that's being felt is fathoms beyond any allegations of impersonation, fraud and things like that. As I say, maybe it's a matter of priorities. The more cynical interpretation is just that they are too frightened of the backlash.
And you had an interesting story today on a new Electoral Commission report on this issue of so-called fake candidates or invisible candidates. Can you just tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, there was a lot of concern during the general election, I think justified, that there were huge swathes of particularly Reform UK candidates, dozens of them, perhaps 70 or 80, who basically voters could find zero information about. They had no social media presence. They didn't submit a bio on any publicly available service. And to all intents and purposes, voters would not know that they were a real person. Now, there's no suggestion that they weren't real people. It's just that these people were getting thousands of votes and it was almost impossible to find out anything.
And it highlighted how few checks there are on these things. Is that right?
It did, yeah. I mean, it highlighted just a bizarre, I suppose, loophole in the rules, which is that now every voter, when they vote in person, they have to show photo ID. But if you're trying to be a candidate and you file your papers to be a candidate, you don't have to prove that you're a real person at all. You don't have to prove any of your details. You don't have to show ID. And there's a potential flaw in the system, I think. And it's something the Electoral Commission has raised in this new report, saying this is a gap, this is a potential issue. But it was one that had a real impact, because there was a YouTuber who followers of his had basically urged supporters.
Nico, I can't remember his surname.
His last name eludes me, sorry, but the article, well, maybe it's
a
good plug to visit bylinetimes.com and read the article about him. But yeah, his supporters had encouraged people to stand as election candidates using his name. So we look at the list of candidates that have his name. There's 11 candidates in the general election who have his name. He had his picture up there, and the 10 other candidates, there's no photo, no identifiable information. And,
and it's still not clear, is it, what exactly happened there? Whether or not the candidates changed their name or whether they put the wrong name down? Are we any closer to knowing what?
We don't know.
Because there was a report that the police were looking at it, but obviously that doesn't seem to have led to anything as far as we can tell.
Yeah, we don't know. It seems the Electoral Commission, whose job it is to monitor these things, don't know either. And our report was a little bit unclear on that. It is notionally a crime to put forward misleading or incorrect candidacy papers. But of course, if no one's looking into it, and the police, they really just don't bother with this stuff, voters might think, okay, we should be focusing on more important issues. And the police, I think, use that as an excuse sometimes. But how often are political crimes, funding scandals, etc., how often are they prosecuted? It's very, very rare indeed.
Another area that the government's coming under pressure on is this issue of farmers. And I was kind of slightly surprised that Kevin Bannon didn't raise that this week. We've got some protests planned with Jeremy Clarkson climbing on a tractor or something coming up. Is that right? Have I got that right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, there's calls for a nationwide strike of farmers. I think there's talk of them descending on London. It's this weekend, I think.
Right, okay.
Descending with their tractors on London, maybe throwing some slurry over government buildings. Who knows? Yeah, Jeremy Clarkson seems to have emerged as a kind of spokesperson for some of these farming interests. I think it's possibly not the most sympathetic figure to lead this. On paper, he's obviously got this successful series, running this farm that he's bought. But he himself admitted that he bought that farm partly to avoid inheritance tax.
Isn't that why he called it diddly squat? Because that was how much inheritance tax he would have to pay. Is that amazing? That's
possible. I don't know. Yeah, that sounds plausible. And James Dyson as well, this massively multi-millionaire owner of the brand of the same name, who suddenly started buying up 36,000 acres of farmland about 10, 15 years ago, pushing up the price of farmland for everyone else. Now, Dyson tell me that inheritance tax had nothing to do with it, and they'd probably come at us with an army of lawyers if we suggested it did. But there are people who just look like not very good spokespeople for this campaign.
And what are we to make of the fact that in the wake of the budget, which we haven't talked about the budget yet, that these are the issues that we've been hearing so much about: inheritance tax, private schools. What are we to make of that?
Yeah, I think a lot of it speaks to who sets the agenda of our political debate, which so often seems to be the agenda is what is on the front page of the Daily Mail or the Daily Telegraph. And I just don't think, maybe it's the media, maybe it's wider commentators, politicos have caught up to the fact that the Telegraph really shouldn't be setting the political agenda anymore. People routed those viewpoints back in July. Maybe we should be paying more attention to, obviously, I would say, the front page of Byline Times, but, even The Guardian. The Guardian's now overtaken the readership of the Daily Mail and The Sun. Do you think those viewpoints that are presented in The Guardian are reflected in the same way that the front page of the Mail and the Telegraph are. The BBC acts like all that really matters is what they're saying rather than these progressive voices. So.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Guardian. Guardian today came out saying that they no longer going to post from their corporate accounts on Twitter, or X as it's now known. And this is an issue that will be in our new edition coming into shops next week, which focus on the influence of Musk and the toxic direction that platform has taken since he took ownership. This is something that came up again after Prime Minister's questions with Kemi Badenoch's team, wasn't it, about Twitter?
Yeah, I asked Kemi Badenoch's spokesman if the Tory party planned on staying on X, and he basically said, I haven't talked to the Conservative leader about that, but the Conservative Party remains alive and kicking on Twitter. But I get the feeling it might be the only ones left alive and kicking on.
You've come off, haven't you? You've come off Twitter.
I've deleted it from my phone. I've basically fully phased out, or I'm getting there. Hello to any Blue Sky and Threads viewers who are listening in. Yeah, I think a lot of people are going that way. There's been a massive surge. I mean, you've seen it on Blue Sky in the past week or two, particularly after Trump winning in the US. And I think for a lot of other people, they will just sort of phase out of platforms like X. When, to be honest, when you go on there and your feed is just full of homophobic, racist comments, bizarre, offensive material that you never signed up to, you think maybe Musk would like this. I don't know, but it's the freedom of the market. People will just move away, and that seems to be at least partly what's happening.
And Starmer's spokespeople, there was a lot of questions about Musk, wasn't there, today in the briefing?
There were, and I think it's again part of this picture of the Conservatives trying to find a wedge, and tabloids as well, to say, look at all these things that the Labour Party figures have said about Elon Musk in the past, said about Donald Trump. You have to look at what some of those comments came in response to. I mean, during the riots earlier this summer, which saw, what was it? It's now 1,500 arrests or something, over 1,000 charges laid. Elon Musk appeared to be deliberately stoking up those riots, sharing far-right material about the situation in the UK, sharing the civil war is inevitable. I think that was on the eve of the riots, if not during. So, you have to say, any responsible political figure would try and dial down some of that rhetoric and say, that's just not responsible.
I mean, another figure who was accused of stoking up those riots was the Reform leader Nigel Farage. Labour ministers have faced a lot of questions about whether he should be brought in as an ambassador to Trump. What do you make of that?
Again, it's political football, isn't it? Everyone knows Keir Starmer would never make Nigel Farage an envoy or ambassador to the US, but it seems to be something that gets a giggle. It's never going to happen, but it's a stick to beat Labour with. What's your take on that?
The idea that you'd have someone like Nigel Farage come in and be a diplomat, given his comments about Russia and Ukraine over the years at this moment of crisis for Ukraine, and it's absurd. But I mean, do you think there are some lessons for Starmer from these events in America and the US elections? Putting Farage aside, should this concern Labour about their prospects at the next general election?
To be honest, I think anyone who is an opponent of the politics that Trump represents, I think needs to be looking really intensely at the result in the US. Obviously, it's different countries, a different political context, but I think it does speak to wider trends in the West. Particularly, you look at opinions that are moving among young men, for example, moving much more towards, in some quarters, that sort of alt-right viewpoint. I mean, that alt-right is now becoming mainstream far-right in the US, and I think it could happen here. And as you mentioned before, that that's going to be something our next issue out later this month is going to focus on. I think none of us can be complacent about the fact that that sort of politics could come here. And when we have social media, like we were touching on, when that is so internationalized, when platforms like X are now controlled by someone who is effectively in the Trump administration, pumping far-right rhetoric around the world, I think we all have to sit up and take notice.
Yeah, it was interesting, wasn't it? I think around the time that Musk took over, there was a story that there was a label put on BBC's feed saying it's state-affiliated media. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Whereas now the entire platform is essentially state-affiliated social media, isn't it?
It's now a wing of the Home Department, or.
I mean, obviously there have been connections between big media owners and political parties and governments, but to actually have a senior advisor to a US president who owns this huge social media platform, that's a massive change, isn't it? And how does the UK government, how do governments around the world respond to something like that?
I have no idea. I imagine there's a lot of frantic discussions going on in departments like the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Maybe they're in disbelief. I mean, there was a lot of talk about them planning for a Trump win. Of course, you'd have to plan for a Trump win given how close the polls were. But I think Elon Musk, this billionaire, far-right international figure who, as you say, controls one of the biggest social media platforms in the world, that is really going to be setting alarm bells ringing. And they will have to make decisions over whether they invite Elon Musk to. That was a source of quite a few questions today in these briefings, was Elon Musk wasn't invited to some investment summit a few months ago. Are they now going to have to invite him? Or when they do invite him to these summits, is he going to be there as a political representative or as an owner of X, formerly Twitter? I mean, it feels unprecedented. It also feels like it's this turn towards this merging of billionaires and the state in the US. It's kind of like
oligarchy,
yeah, sort of old school corporatism, like 19th century, I don't know, robber barons or steel barons working hand in glove with public sector and government officials. It's both extremely modern, I think extremely archaic at the same time. It's really weird.
And so far, Keir Starmer's response to all this, I think probably understandably, has been to say, oh, well, we look forward to working, we heard that several times today, we look forward to working with the new Trump administration and securing this long-lasting alliance between the UK and the US. I mean, how tenable is that when he starts doing things like sort of mass deportations, if he cuts all of US aid to Ukraine? I mean, how tenable is that line? How long can they keep that going, particularly on the Ukraine issue?
Perhaps they're going to keep a closed mouth in public, but having extremely frantic diplomatic discussions behind the scenes. But at the end of the day, if Trump is deporting 11 million people and it ends up being as dystopian and potentially violent as it's expected to be, then you would think that Prime Minister, who was a human rights lawyer, might have something to say about it. We'll see. I'm not sure how long that position can hold.
And we had Keir Starmer going out to meet Macron, attending Armistice Day. Does this open up the discussion again about whether or not the UK should form closer alliances with Europe, even reopen the question of Brexit?
Yeah, I think those questions surely have to be reignited. I think Keir Starmer is subtly or not so subtly starting that conversation in public now with these very public visits to France and meeting Macron, as you say. There is an opportunity, you have to look for silver linings in situations like these, I think, for the UK to work much more closely with the European Union. And I think, to be honest, if Trump starts slapping massive taxes on UK goods coming into the US, then there is going to have to be some greater collaboration with our biggest trading neighbour, which is the European Union.
Of course, we could see those tariffs. I mean, a lot of this could go badly wrong for the Trump administration, couldn't it? I mean, tariffs could hurt US economy just as much as it hurts other economies around the world.
Yeah, and there's that phrase, isn't there? F around and find out. I think the US is going to find out if Trump does follow through with his promises. Most economic projections say that if he slaps on these massive tariffs on goods coming into the US, inflation is going to go wild. And that was exactly what Joe Biden was just kicked out for, arguably. So in 2 years, in the midterms, in 4 years, certainly when he comes to the end of what will have to be his last term, unless he gets away with some constitutional chicanery, he's going to be facing these major economic issues potentially.
And as an incumbent, he may well struggle for re-election. And one of the interesting analysis that's been doing the rounds is showing how pretty much every government in the world that has had elections in the last year or so has either been kicked out or has severely retreated in terms of their share of the vote. Is it inevitable that the same will happen to a Labour government?
I really withdraw from the phrase inevitability in politics because it feels like whenever we say something is inevitable, the exact opposite happens. So, yeah, I maybe wouldn't say inevitable, but yeah, if inflation rises again in the UK, that's going to put a lot of pressure on Keir Starmer's government. I think in a sense, they were kind of lucky that massive inflation of the pandemic happened under Conservatives, because I think if that happened under Labour, they would suffer a potentially even more catastrophic defeat than the Conservatives just suffered. So it's obviously untrue that Labour inherited a very positive economic outlook, but also inflation was a lot lower than the peak of, 11% during the aftermath of the pandemic. And, we saw some slight warning signs with unemployment figures this week. Labour will have to keep a close eye on that. But at the end of the day, it is the economy that people tend to vote on most of the time. So Labour will be judged on that record.
And what does Starmer need to do to kind of fight off? I mean, we saw him coming under one of the key parts of the Democrats' loss was groups of voters who'd previously backed them staying at home, essentially. And I think events in Gaza was certainly parts of that. Keir Starmer faced some questions today, didn't he? Prime Minister's questions about Gaza? Just tell us what that was about.
I mean, it was an awkward issue. Awkward is maybe perhaps too light a word to use for something that is complete humanitarian disaster, but it was a difficult issue for the Democrats in the US. They didn't really seem to have the answers on the question of the war on Gaza. And I think Keir Starmer is trying to tread quite a careful line, saying it's obviously a terrible humanitarian crisis that's happening there, but he refused today, in response to a question from an independent MP, to call it a genocide. He said, basically speaking as a former human rights lawyer, I know what the definition of genocide is, and it isn't that, effectively. Now, I think that will anger perhaps a lot of people on the left of the Labour Party, but he is trying to bridge this gap, really, between people who think this is a humanitarian disaster but won't go as far as to call it.
And what are we to make of that? Because that was probably one of the most difficult parts of the run-up to the general election, was his position on Gaza. And we saw the reason that question was asked by an independent is because the Labour Party lost a number of elections to independents largely on that issue. Has he come close to squaring that circle? As you say, it is a difficult issue for any government to deal with, but what do you make of his response to that?
I think it's still a struggle to the Labour Party, but looking at this more broadly, Trump has just recruited Mike Huckabee to be his envoy for Israel, isn't it? This extreme hardliner who wants to see massive rollout of settlements in the West Bank, appointing people who basically want the destruction of Palestine as any form of entity. So I think Keir Starmer will look much more liberal in comparison to some of those viewpoints, which at the end of the day, US being Israel's main supporter on the world stage, main funder, provider of arms, I think that's unfortunately going to carry a lot more weight than what Keir Starmer says.
And as important as Gaza is to many people, I think most people would accept that the crucial issue for whether or not a Labour government gets elected next time is the NHS. We had Wes Streeting out today talking about reforms. Can you tell us anything about that?
Yeah, Labour and Wes Streeting, obviously, he's seen as being on the centre, perhaps centre-right of the Labour Party as Health Secretary. He's been much more open to talking about reform of the NHS than certainly someone like Jeremy Corbyn would be, or even Keir Starmer, probably when he was running to be Labour leader. But it does come in the aftermath of this landmark report from Lord Darzi, which said basically that the structure of the NHS is broken. You were seeing huge amounts of money, extra money pumped into the health service and not always feeding through to better outcomes for patients. And I think Wes Streeting is kind of latching onto that. We saw the launch of this consultation with the public, this so-called listening exercise, which I think was a kind of, partly it was a genuine listening exercise. I think really a bigger part of it was a kind of PR push to present the message to the public that the NHS really has to change in England. Of course, NHS is devolved in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, but I think there will be changes coming. And when the Prime Minister's spokesperson was asked about this after PMQs, and his political press secretary as well, from a Labour standpoint, they were asked, is the only red line really that the NHS has to stay free at the point of use? And, anything else goes, basically. I mean, the response to that was pretty much, yes, that is the red line, but it does feel like potentially the door is open to much more involvement from private sector providers.
And we had Labour MP Diane Abbott today saying this is all a sort of prelude to privatisation. Is it?
It's hard to say. I mean, there has always been private involvement in the NHS. Of course, GPs are private independent operators, dentistry, largely private. This is a debate that's been going back to the very start of the health service and in the very early years when Bevan resigned over the introduction of, I think it was prescription fees for opticians, which, previously free. So this is something that the Labour Party always struggles with. And I think there's a genuine fear after the past 14 years, we've seen botched NHS reforms. The word reform just means privatisation. Yeah. And I think Labour have a bit of a fight on their hands to try and persuade people that reform from a Labour standpoint doesn't just mean more privatisation, that it can actually mean just changing how the NHS works.
And some of the appointments they've made, Alan Milburn, he's got ties to the private health industry. He's worked on various boards for private health companies. I mean, you can understand where some of the sort of suspicion from this has come from.
Oh, totally. And there's a lot of links basically between private health firms and lobbyists and funders for the Labour Party who you could argue don't have the NHS's best interests at heart, profit being the driving motive of their interactions. But yeah, I think we'll have to see what the concrete proposals that Labour
and
come forward
Labour
with.
have come under a lot of scrutiny in recent months for their own donations, election, and also some of the sort of connected groups like Labour Together, who've got connections to some of these industries.
Yeah, and I think maybe we'll see more of that over the next few years. Labour's membership, they've become less reliant on members to fund the party over the past few years and much more reliant on these private interests. And I think now that they're in government, some of those links will be a lot more closely scrutinised.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Josiah. Good to speak to you. And I'm sure we'll be back again to talk about all these things. Just a quick reminder to everyone at home, we do have the new edition of Byline Times coming out soon. If you subscribe on bylinetimes.com, you will get an edition sent to you in the post. If not, you can pick it up from leading supermarkets and newsagents from middle to end of next week. Thank you very much for enjoying it. Thank you again, Josiah.
Thanks, Adam.
And we'll see you again soon.
I know.